Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullah, alhamdulillah, wa salatu wa salam ala rasulillah sallallahu alayhi wa sallam. I'd like to thank everyone for joining us again. We've been having weekly sessions related to racism, and we've been having different speakers come along and share their views, their ideas, and the research that they've done on the issue of racism, especially here in America. So today we have another topic for you: eradicating racism, how to get it done. So it's a challenging question, but our esteemed speakers, Imam Khalid, Griggs, and Dr. Jimmy Jones, are both here. Dr. Jimmy Jones here as well. He'll come after, but they're going to speak about this topic and share their resources, their wisdom, their knowledge on the topic, and we hope you all will listen to it and benefit and share with your family and friends. So we would really like for you to hear them out and try to take notes possible as well. They'll be providing the practical solutions for all in ways that how we can get involved and try to eradicate this problem from our society. We will be taking questions afterwards. So if you have questions, please put them in the comment section, and they'll speak about them afterwards. Our first speaker will be our own Imam Khalid Griggs. He's part of our ICNA family. He's the vice president of the ICNA. He's also been the lead for ICNA Council for Social Justice for many years. We look up to him for guidance. He was our chairman for many years as well. So without further ado, Imam Khalid Griggs.
Bismillahir-Rahmanir-Rahim. Assalamu alaikum. When Brother Ramiz told me the topic, my gut reaction was, well, good luck with that in terms of eliminating racism from American society. And the reason why I had that kind of cynical gut response is that racism is so fundamental to the American way of life. It has been fundamental since the inception of the country. And whereas individuals are able to reform, they're able to have exposure to people who don't look like them and who don't come from the same cultural background, it is a little more difficult to dismantle the system of structural racism that has been so embedded in this nation that we find ourselves with such gross disparities with the white population and the African-American population in particular. So the idea, and this may not be the most popular thing for me to say at this point, but I honestly believe that racism in some degree or another in the human heart will always have a place here in the United States. So my particular concern is more for removing those racist barriers, those barriers that are erected through structural racism that prohibit particularly African-American people and other people of color from advancing in the society in a way that others who, who are not white are advancing the way that white folks, in particular, would be able to advance in the society. So there are a number of ways that I think we can move towards this ideal state in which the racism of the society would not be the dominant credential that is brought in every social institution that we have in this country of the United States. And in continuing along that vein, it is very important that we acknowledge, as many people after the extrajudicial murder of George Floyd, as many Americans across this nation have acknowledged that something is terribly wrong with a country that would tolerate the kind of structural endemic racism that has been reflected in this killer cop suffocating the life out of the body of Mr. George Floyd. And what makes it even worse and what makes it so clear that this was an act of just blatant racism and a callous disregard for human life because that person was of African descent, was the way that Kevin Calkin was actually, to me, he was like posing, hand in pocket, knee on neck, people pleading with him to stop, Mr. Floyd pleading with him to stop because he was cutting off his air, his circulation, he couldn't breathe. With cameras, cell phones, taking this man's picture and videoing him, he still refused to stop the deadly acts that resulted in the death of Mr. Floyd. So this act is just one of thousands, hundreds of acts that have been committed on a day-to-day basis all across this nation. Even after the murder by Mr. Floyd of this killer cop, there have been incidences by police departments across the country after that, including another police officer in another city placing his knee on the neck in spite of all the attention that Mr. Floyd's extrajudicial killing has brought to the attention of the American people. And so Dr. Jones is going to elaborate more specifically about this issue of racism and structural racism. He will give some solutions that all of us are capable within our grasp to be able to implement certain changes that would militate against racism and structural racism in this country. So I'm going to shift gears for a moment and talk about an upcoming event that has been labeled as the Poor People's Campaign. And it's a moral revival for this country. It's being led by Dr. William Barber and Reverend Liz Theo-Harris. Reverend Liz is the director of the Cairo Institute here, an anti-racist organization in this country. And Dr. Barber has gained wide attention for his work as a civil rights activist, as formerly as the chair of the North Carolina NAACP. I think he's still on the national board of the NAACP. But Dr. Barber was an advocate and a student of the work of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. In 1967, more specifically in November of 1967, Dr. King told his staff that he was going to organize a Poor People's Campaign, going to Washington, D.C., and not groveling to the legislatures and begging them to implement meaningful changes for Black and oppressed people in this country, but to go with an attitude that these are our human rights. We are just demanding for you to grant those rights that as human beings we should have anyway. This was a change in verbiage, and it was a change in attitude that Dr. King had during this last year of his life, signaled by his speech at the Riverside Church in Harlem on April the 4th, 1967. There was a noticeable, if I can use the term, more militant tone to the words of Dr. King as it related to changing the environment in the United States, from one that was very oppressive to Black people and people of color at this time to one that was all inclusive. So Dr. King told his staff in November that on Mother's Day, which was May 12, 1968, that he wanted to create this resurrection city. He wanted to go to Washington, D.C., camp out on the Washington Monument, and over a period of a month, stay in that area and pressure the congressmen and senators to bring about legislation that was beneficial to all of the citizens of the country. Of course, he was assassinated before this May event on October the on April the 4th, 1968, he was assassinated. But Dr. Ralph Abernathy, who took over the organization of the Southern Christian Leadership Associate Conference after the assassination of Dr. King, and the leaders of this group decided that they were going to go on with it. So they did. And they camped out on Washington Mall for 30 days before the Interior Department forced them to move. Now, Dr. William Barber looked at this particular event and studied this particular event and realized that there was unfinished business that remained to be done. And so Dr. Barber had been involved with a movement that became identified and called Moral Mondays. Moral Mondays, and I don't have the time to get into all of the history of it, but the Moral Mondays represented events at the state capitol in North Carolina, in Raleigh, North Carolina, where 18 Monday events were held on the grounds of the state capitol. And this was a kind of fusion movement. You had people representing various elements and various aspects of demands in American society. You had people who were there who were demanding minimum wage, and this was in a very organized way. It was not chaotic, but you had people demanding minimum wage. You had Muslims involved who at that time were trying to deter the state legislature and convince other protesters that the state of North Carolina should not adopt an anti-Sharia law bill, and which it actually ended up doing anyway. So you had people from all walks of life. You had educators. You had government reform, people who were there specifically for trying to stop the attempts to suppress the vote of particularly Black people all across the country. And from these 18 Moral Mondays, Reverend Barber in particular was able to go to other states across the country. And it ended up, and my number may be wrong, I think it's probably less, but there, in 12 different states, Moral Monday demonstrations were held that emulated the kinds of demands and the kinds of actions that had been done in North Carolina. Now, from this, Reverend Barber organizationally got with Reverend Liz Theo Harris with the Cairo Institute, and they formed a group called Breachers Faith. I'm sorry, the name escapes me right now. And from that vantage point, it was organized, a plan was implemented and organized to hold a poor people's campaign in Washington, D.C. on June the 20th of this year. Of course, the physical gathering will be and was interrupted because of COVID-19. So there's going to be a digital campaign, of a fusion movement of bringing together the various elements of people that I had mentioned before and coming together in a digital format. And the ICNA and ICNA Council for Social Justice endorse this particular initiative. As a matter of fact, we are partners, part of the national partners for this particular movement. And just in a few minutes, I just want to share, if you allow, just a few things about the demands that will be presented at this event on June the 20th using a digital platform. Just like the demands of the Moral Monday movements, you have in this fusion movement, you have a large factor, a large segment of people who are participating because of their trying to advocate for a living wage. But in their involvement, just like those who are trying to restore true democracy as it relates to voting and stop the voter suppression that so many people in different parties, particularly in the Republican Party. Different people are trying to suppress the vote of Black and minority people and even women in more rural areas, and all kinds of nefarious moves have been made to do that. So people are coming in areas demanding reforms in the healthcare for universal healthcare. And all of this has been very systematically studied, and the numbers have been crunched. And after crunching the numbers, it's understood that the kinds of changes that are being advocated for can easily be accomplished if there's certain areas that experience budgetary cuts. First and foremost will be the military. There's no need for the United States to have over 900 military bases all around the world. There's no need for the military budget, annual budget of the United States to be almost $800 million a year. And so if monies are taken, and what Poor People's Campaign are advocating for, if monies are rerouted from the military, if monies are rerouted from local police departments who also have very inflated budgets. As a matter of fact, in 1968, 3 months after the assassination of Dr. Martin Luther King, there was a bill passed in Congress. And this bill was called the Omnibus Crime and Safe Streets Act. And what this did was to give authority to the various military, U.S. military divisions to provide virtually free of charge surplus military hardware to give to local police departments. And they had plenty of hardware to give away because they had such bloated budgets. And so as a result of this omnibus crime bill and Safe Streets Act in 1968, this was the beginning of the militarization of police departments across the country. And it was the seed that started to sprout, where because of their military capacity, that police departments were able to assume roles, to be trained in occupation overseas, but to assume roles of military occupation, particularly as it related to the Black and other communities of color in this country. And so I mentioned this and trying to tie this in to what we have seen unfolding in the streets of this country over the last few years. We have this event of Mr. Floyd being choked out with this man's knee on his neck. And it has struck a nerve in the collective conscience of people all across this country. I've participated, just like Dr. Jones and Brother Ramiz, I participated in a number of demonstrations and social actions in my high school up to my adult life, up until today. I have never seen the kind of response that we are seeing across America today to what happened to Mr. Floyd. And by that, I mean the continuous demonstrations. I've never seen that, even back in the day with the anti-Vietnam War protests. It was maybe once a week, twice a week, somewhere, mostly converging in Washington, D.C. But we're talking about, for the last 14 days, daily massive demonstrations all over the country, all 50 states, and dozens of countries across the world as well. And so people are at the point, this is the time that if ever there is a window of opportunity to make very practical changes to the system of structural racism that so inhibits and prohibits equal access to the fruits of American society, to designated people, to try to keep, in particular, African-American people in the undercarriage of American society. If in fact there was ever a window of opportunity, now is that time. And if in fact, particularly us as Muslims, if there's ever a time in which we are compelled, we are morally, religiously, and out of just good sense and good conscience, compelled to be involved, to express our outrage in tangible, concrete ways, this is that time. Otherwise, if we don't, and I'll stop at this point, if we don't, we will find ourselves on the wrong side of history. We'll find ourselves on Qiyamah, being questioned by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala that during this time that I set the stage for you all to be involved in changing in meaningful ways the society in which you live and the society in which you say you love. And what did you do? How did you take advantage of this opportunity? So I'm suggesting for the presence on June 20th, but also in the continuous systematic efforts to bring about meaningful social change, that we, those of us in the Muslim community, register and participate in this Poor People's campaign on June the 20th. It's very easy to register for it. Register for this, understand what's going on, plug into that beyond just June the 20th. Please look at the ICNA Council for Social Justice as an avenue for instruction and guidance and direction and organizational lending organizational expertise to our ongoing efforts. And I'll stop at this particular point. Now, if you don't come on, I'm gonna keep talking.
Thank you so much for coming and sharing your thoughts as always. It's highly appreciated. So next, inshallah, we will have Dr. Jimmy Jones. Dr. Jimmy Jones has been involved in advocacy and anti-racist stuff for a long time. He had a Bilal initiative going on for a while, I remember. And so he can maybe talk about more than that. I'll just give you a quick bio of Dr. Jimmy Jones. Those of you who may not know him, he's as of January 1st, he's the board of directors for the Islamic Seminary Foundation and an appointed professor to the position of executive vice president. He has a bachelor's degree in history from Hampton University, a master's in religion from Yale Divinity School, and a doctorate, a PhD from Harvard Seminary. And he recently retired from Manhattan College, where he was a professor of African Studies, World Religions, and chair of both programs. And I actually had an opportunity to study with him comparative religion for about a year at Islamic Online University. And it was so he was a really good teacher. I learned a lot. So really hear him out. He has a lot to share, a lot of knowledge to share, a lot of wisdom. So without further ado, Dr. Jimmy Jones.
Bismillah, alhamdulillah, wa salatu wa salam ala rasulillah. So at the Islamic Seminary of America, our primary task is to try to teach. We just finished a course on counseling cross-cultural communication that touches on this. And we just we just had a course called The Power of Prejudice during our first semester. And we just did a webinar called Black Lives Matter, which you can find at the TISA YouTube channel. I begin my presentation on educating racism, what should we say, by saying to America, by saying to people who are not African Americans in America, by saying to African Americans, we have the right to be outraged. We have the right to be outraged. I sit in New Haven, Connecticut in a, quote, inner city community, which has a reputation of having people who are formerly incarcerated, has a reputation for drug dealing. And so you can imagine that I live in a neighborhood similar to the one that Mr. Floyd perished in. 23 years ago, I lived across town in another inner city neighborhood. And I got a call. It was in April of 1997. My son Malik Jones had been killed by a police officer at the end of a traffic stop. We have the right to be outraged. We have the right to be outraged. So what we want to do with that context is talk about eradicating racism and what we should do, because we want to have a conversation. We're going to go quickly through these slides, and we're going to start with A, B, and C. We always start in the seminary with Quran because it's the source of all knowledge. Ya ayyuhalladhina amanu, right? Oh, you believe. This is a famous ayah from the Quran that's so famous that Harvard University has it posted outside of its library as words of justice. I mean, this is a worldwide universal standard of justice, right? Stand out firmly for justice as witness to Allah, even as against yourselves. The A in the ABCs stands for affirm your humanity by maintaining the divine connection. If you want to do something about eradicating racism in the current context in the United States, you have to see yourself as a human being with responsibilities to the rest of the human beings for affirming their humanity and their affirming yours. If you want to do something about eradicating racism as we see it in the United States, you're going to have to affirm your humanity. Allah makes it clear in the Quran, and he said the same surah of the Quran, Ya ayyuhan nas, O humanity, be mindful of your duty to your Lord. Why? Right? Because he created you from one person, and the one person he created his mate, and from the two of them spread countless men and women throughout the earth. So we need to affirm that humanity, that the fact that we're all from one human family, despite the ideas that people push on us. We're one humanity. Biology says so, but more importantly, the Quran says so. And what biology says about this is that the common ancestor to every human being who's alive on the face of the earth is an African person. Mitochondrial Eve is what it's called in biology. And so if we're so uptight about, who we are, understand from that perspective, we're all cousins. So I like to quote El-Hajj Malik Shabazz because he was a formative person in my life when I read his autobiography. And this is from a series of speeches, actually, that he gave the young people. And he used to say, one of the first things I think young people, especially nowadays, and this has been a while, should learn how to do is to see for yourself, listen for yourself, and think for yourself. Then you can come to an intelligent decision for yourself. When it comes to eradicating racism, sometimes we respond in kind to the people who are being racist against us. One of the best things that we can do these days is to see for ourselves, listen for ourselves, and think for ourselves. Don't follow the crowd. So B in ABC stands for battle the boxes that people stick us in. Battle the boxes. People want to stick us in. I live in an inner city neighborhood. Therefore, I must be a drug dealer. I must be a person who carries a weapon. I do neither. I've never done it. So we should battle those boxes by affirming our humanity and standing up and being leaders. Muslims ought to be leaders in terms of fighting racism, anything that's going on negative in the community, by remembering the role models that we have. Maryam, our mother Maryam, she was so important in Islam that the 19th chapter of the Quran, she's the mother of Isa alayhi salam, of Jesus, that the 19th chapter of the Quran is named after her, and she's seen as very important in Islam and Christianity, which is a large segment of the world today. But when she was alive, she was a marginalized person for two reasons or more. One is because he was Jewish at the time when Jewish people were looked down upon, and they're still looked down upon in many areas today. And secondly, she lived in a gendered society where people dealt with her as a woman in a way. And you know the story in the Quran, if you read Surah Maryam, of how people questioning her, right? They're questioning her about the miraculous birth that Allah Ta'ala caused. And so being a marginalized person, here's the point, being a person who is outside the norm of what's supposed to be right for society doesn't mean that you can't eradicate some ideas or stand up and be a person who's a harbinger. She was the forerunner for a son, Jesus Christ, and this is one example. Another example is somebody you probably haven't heard of. Her name is Elizabeth Freeman. In 1780, there was a proclamation in a town called Sheffield in Western Massachusetts that read that all men are born free and equal. At this time, Mary Elizabeth Freeman was a slave, but she went and found herself a lawyer. She said, if all men are created equal, why am I a slave? Why am I a slave? This is one of the first persons to go to court in 1781, right, to sue and win her own freedom, which led to the abolition of slavery in Massachusetts in the whole state. Massachusetts, parenthetically, was the first state to legalize slavery and was the first state to make it legal, partially because this woman who was a formerly enslaved woman, look it up, Mary Elizabeth Freeman, stood up and said, I ain't no critter. That's what she said. I ain't no animal. I'm a person. And she found herself a lawyer. And actually, her name wasn't Freeman. She changed her name to Freeman because she wanted her name to reflect her situation. So if we want to battle the boxes, think about it. We don't think of women who've been enslaved as people who stand up for themselves. We don't think of women who've been enslaved as people who go and get a lawyer because they're enslaved. We don't think of women as being enslaved as people who would go to court and speak for themselves. And we certainly don't think of women as being enslaved as changing the laws of a state, changing the laws of the state of Massachusetts. The third person I'd like to mention as a role model in terms of battling the boxes is Ida B. Wells. She was born in slavery, right, in the 1890s, right? And she was an American journalist, educator, and an early leader in the civil rights movement. She was one of the founders of the NAACP. Many people don't know about her. And so the point I'm trying to make here is that in spite of the fact that she was looked down upon looked down upon, right? She was born in 1862. She was looked down upon. She compiled documents of lynching in the United States and wrote so fiercely against lynching that she had to be run out of Tennessee. She had to leave the state. This is, again, a person battling the boxes. Remember, this is the latter part of the 19th century. This is a Black woman who's a journalist, who's documenting what's happening to Black people in this country, and she ended up being run out of town. So battle the boxes that people put us in. One of the first things, as Malcolm X said, young people, especially nowadays, should learn to do is to see for yourself, listen for yourself, and think for yourself. So what's the C about in the A, B, and C? Here's a quote from somebody that most of you probably never heard of. She used to, in her talks, just like Malcolm X used to end his talks, start his talks with one of the best things that young people can do is think for themselves. She used to end her talks by saying, remember the past, don't hate, and don't be a bystander. This is good advice if somebody wants to embody the C, the collaboration for the good. You should remember what's gone on before you. You shouldn't, Martin Luther King, with his nonviolent direct action, Imam Khalid talked about it a few moments ago, would never start a demonstration without a 4-step process when he went from city to city with his very, very ultimately successful civil rights movement. First, he would do research, right? And to find out what the problem was. Second, he would meet with the people in power to try to negotiate for a change against the racist Jim Crow laws that were throughout the United States at that time. Third, and this is extremely important for us Muslims, extremely important, he went through a process of self-purification. Why? Because he wanted to make sure he wasn't doing it to get revenge. Why? He wanted to make sure that he wasn't doing it in order to be violent against the white people. Why? Is because he wanted to make sure he wasn't dehumanizing other people. Remember, the first point is affirm your humanity. So the third step of Dr. King was self-purification. Then if the research was right, if the people in charge refused, if self-purification, and he did it in his own tradition, they would pray and they would ask God for guidance, and then they moved to collaborate for the good. And so Hetty Epstein says, remember the past, don't hate, don't be a bystander. She was a Holocaust survivor. And so where do we find Hetty Epstein, this Holocaust survivor, in 2014? It turns out that with the death of Michael Brown, she ended up in front of the St. Louis office of Jay Nixon, the governor of Missouri, protesting the death of Michael Brown. Reach out and collaborate for the good. Even though she was 90 years old at this particular time, she died, a couple of years later. She was 90 years old at this time. She had survived the Holocaust, but she was collaborating for the good. She was reaching outside of her people in order to collaborate for the good and standing up with the Black Lives Matter movement. The other thing to know about Hetty Epstein, who used to say, remember the past, don't hate, and don't be a bystander. She was a staunch supporter of Palestinian rights. Even though she was Jewish, she was a staunch supporter of Palestinian rights. Collaborate for the good. So she was a supporter of Palestinian rights. She was a supporter of Black Lives Matter. And this is the way we ought to be in terms of leadership, in terms of eradicating racism. But ultimately, the BLM for us should be like Muhammad alayhi salatu wasalam. So before I wrap up with some tips on what I think I should do, I just want to go back to January of 2005. And I want to go and just remind our viewers of why we should be outraged in this particular situation. Because with George Floyd, we have a situation of a person who lived in the same kind of community that I live in, even though I made a fairly decent salary as a professor, an inner city neighborhood. He moved from Houston, and he ended up getting killed in the new city that he was in. We have somebody who embodied the American dream. She came to the United States as an immigrant. She went to school. She got educated. She became a medical doctor. And when she was killed by the police, she was trying to help. Her name is on that list. The list is so powerfully, outrageously long. Please don't forget her and what she represents. Don't forget her in your du'as. Her name is Dr. Jamila Yasmin Arshad. My friend, Dr. Imam Omar Suleiman has been bringing this to mind. Don't forget her. She represents the American dream. She was an immigrant. She was educated. She was a medical professional. She was a convert to Islam. She was a wife. She was a mother, humanitarian. But in January of 2005, she ended up dead at the hands of police. What happened quickly? She was driving home from work. She saw that a young kid had been hit by a car. She stopped to help, a medical doctor. People did not believe that she was a doctor because she was a Black woman. The one person called the police on her, not the EMTs for the boy, but on her. The police came and she said, I'm a doctor, didn't believe her, and threw her to the ground. 51-year-old woman, just because she was Black. She gets up, she's flustered, she swings her arm, then the police makes a leg sweep and then sits on her back, handcuffs her, and throws her in the back of the police car. Another man comes along, sees her in the police car, Her mouth is foaming. This is all in the court documents, and says you should look after her. And the policeman said, well, I don't have the keys. It took another 10 minutes for them to get her out, where the hospital was only 5 minutes away. She died that night at the hands of this Louisiana police officers, and no one has been charged. We have the right to be outraged. So what does the C stand for? Collaborate for the good. Here's 3 things to do quickly, and we'll wrap up so you can have a chance to ask this question. Number 1, take the Muslim Ark Pledge. The sacred pledge, I won't read it now, but we know in Islam, actions are by intention. You have to intend to fight this racism. You have to be part of the solution and not part of the problem. And more so, if you live in a society where you benefit from the racism, you should be in the forefront of fighting against it. Number 2, work to overhaul 3 systems. I only chose 3 of them. There are other ones. The so-called criminal justice system, which the police are part of, but if you look at the jails and correctional facilities, you'll find Black people overrepresented. The healthcare system, where Dr. Jamila belonged to, and it didn't save her being a medical doctor, subhanAllah. And that healthcare system, actually, a Black woman who looks like Dr. Jamila is 4 times likely to die, 4 times likely to die than a white woman because of pregnancy and childbirth complications. SubhanAllah, in the United States of America, the home of the free and the land of the brave, the baby of that Black woman is twice as likely to die before their first birthday than a white child. This is a sin. The healthcare system is broken for everybody, but it's worse for people of color and for women. And finally, the U.S. food delivery system. We don't talk about it much, but really, we live in a fast food nation. And one of the reasons we have so many underlying conditions that led to us being overrepresented and the population being devastated by this plague is because we eat this junk. Take a look at fast food nation, and then think about what we can do for the food deserts, like the inner city neighborhood that I live in, to bring some healthy food that'll help us with those underlying conditions. There's a book called Fast Food Nation, and there's a movie version. And finally, as I said, be like Muhammad alayhi salatu wasalam. 2 books I recommend are The Medinian Society at the Time of the Prophet alayhi salatu wasalam by Al-Umari, and Revelation by Brother Miraj Muhuddin, which is a book that many people don't know about, but brings the seerah, the biography, up to date, and the kinds of transformational movements that our beloved prophet made. We have a prophetic paradigm. We have a way of doing things, and we should plumb our prophetic paradigm in terms of helping to overhaul this nation, not just eradicating racism, right? You're the best of the people created for mankind, right? The prophet is a witness for you. You're the witness for all humanity. We should fight racism. We should march. We should protest the deaths of people like George Floyd. But we remember that we have a higher calling to contextualize the prophetic paradigm. And this is something we only do if we pay attention to our deed, if we plumb the depths of the deed, if we have spiritual practice where we're connected to the deed, and we make sure that we and our families know about the prophet's paradigm, which was transformational at that time and could be transformational now. And so we often quote this at the end of talks like this, and it's apropos. Yeah, and you're not. Oh, humanity. He created you from a single pair, male and female, and made you into nations and tribes that you may know one another. We Muslims should be in the leadership as making this as part of the ethos of the United States of America. We have the right to be outraged. We have the right to be outraged, but we must be in the leadership of providing the prophetic paradigm. Walhamdulillahi Rabbil Alameen.
Okay, Jazakallah khair, Dr. Jimmy Jones, for that enlightening speech. And I didn't know the story of the sister, so that's interesting. You might look it up later for more information. And thank you for the book recommendations as well. I think it's important to connect all of our struggles back to our religion somehow, to get that spiritual aspect of it as well. So we are taking questions now. If anyone has any questions, they can put them in the comment section, and we'll have them try to answer it, inshallah. If not, then we'll just take some final thoughts, and then we will end the program. So if anyone has any questions, please put them in the comment section. I think someone liked this comment of yours about BLM, be like Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam. You want to elaborate on that? What that means exactly?
Right. On the one hand, Muhammad alayhi salatu wasalam, when he was in Mecca, he was a minority, right? He was an ostracized minority. He had been an orphan. He was a marginalized person because he was an orphan, and he had to have the protection of his uncle. And even at that time, he stepped up to help bring people together. He stepped up to be part of an organization that helped the poor and the dispossessed, even though he was marginalized. That's really my point. Even though he was marginalized. And then when he made the hijrah to Medina, one thing that he did there is he brought together the Ansar and the Muhajirin. They came from two different cultures. If you make Hajj and you go to Mecca and Medina, those cities even feel different today. It's like move from New York City to a small town in an hour. These are two different cultures. And so if he were the head of a corporation, he would be called a brilliant person in terms of the merging of these two cultures in a way that ultimately changed the civilized world. So, because within 30 years after him going to Medina, the civilized world had Islam, right? And so a point I want to make about this is that what we need to remember is that when the civilized world was led by Islam, the Prophet Islam had already died. So our point, as I said, one of the reasons for taking the Muslim archer is that you're near. That our intention should be service to Allah and the way of His beloved Messenger Islam. Not, I'm the main administrator at the Islamic Seminary in America, but my niyyah shouldn't be focused on the seminary itself. My intention, if you see the difference here, my intention is to make sure that this institution, inshallah, serves the way of my Lord and the way of my beloved Prophet. If for some reason that it begins not to serve that purpose, we, the board, everybody on my board is going to go crazy when they see this, right? We should give it up. And the second part of this is that we should expect that because we're doing it, that it's going to be successful. The best thing we can do is make our niyyah, put our best effort forward for the change, and leave the rest to our Lord.
Okay, that makes sense. So we have two questions from Tracy Smith. So she's got a two-part question. She's saying, what can the white American community do right now? Most of us want to support and change from within and from without. So maybe we can start with Imam Khalid, and then Dr. Jimmy Jones can add his thoughts as well.
Yeah, that's a very good question. And, there have been a number of discussions in recent days and recent months about what good people, white folks of good conscience, who have had it in their hearts to want to do something, but the avenues to make concrete changes in race relations or in the structure of races in this country seemed out of hand and out of reach. But I think that there are a couple of things that we have to look at. The onus of making structural changes about race in this country, the onus is primarily on white folks. And by that, I mean that because African Americans, for the most part, are not in positions of influence or control. So the problem of the elimination of racism in this country as I think Dr. King understood it, and articulated, especially within the last year of his life, as El-Hajj Malik El-Shabazz, Malcolm understood that our role as Black folks and other people of color is to be that mirror that is held up to white America so that you can see yourself and see the structures that have been created and the pain that it has caused. And I'm not meaning you personally, but just what white America, the structures that have been created, because sometimes folks get lost in tradition. And so a system of systematic oppression has become a tradition. It's part of the American way. And so what I would suggest as a white American, the most valuable contribution that you can make is to help influence other white folks. I'm not saying don't coalesce and work with non-white Muslims and African Americans and other people, but do the organizational work, do the work in your community that can best influence the change and the desire for change in your friends and relatives and people of influence and others. So I think the role for you is a very valuable role. It's a very important role. And to a certain degree, it has sometimes you have the greatest potential to directly impact and influence the racial attitudes and direction of the nation if you organize and do the work yourself.
Okay. So I've been talking about these issues for a long time, over 50 years in Hampton Institute, and my answer now is different from then. My answer then, when a young white woman came over, was primarily what Imam Khalid Griggs says is, you need to get with your people. But I want to suggest three things that I think white people, so-called white people, because there's no such thing as a white race. That's, you take our power prejudice course, we'll talk about it. There's no such thing as a black race. Yeah, even that's to talk a rebel and so on to end. But the three things I would recommend so-called white folks. The other thing is there's so much intermarriage in this country is that in the past 50 years is that the racial makeup of this country has changed. But again, let's go with the idea of white and black folks. And first, I would say three things. I just jotted them down here. First, educate yourself. Secondly, right, engage with the African American and the Muslim community. And third, dismantle. Educate yourself. Much of what we think about race has nothing to do with history. For instance, two books I would recommend to so-called white folks is a book called The Whiteness of a Different Color, wherein the history of immigration in this country is tracked by notions of whiteness. When Italians came here, they weren't white. When Jewish people came here, they weren't white. That has a consequence for us understanding what race means in the here and now. I mean, I don't have time to dig into it, but read that book. The other thing I would suggest you read is a book called The War Against the Weak. The War Against the Weak. While Southerners primarily, wasn't just Southerners, were lynching black folks and making postcards of it. Who does that? They would lynch black folks, and photographers knew, they take a picture of it, 20 postcards, and they send it to their friends. This is like a picnic in the park, right? Who does that? But my point is while they were lynching about 4,000 black folks between Reconstruction and 1970, there was something going on called the eugenics movement in the United States, led by liberal progressives. That's why I don't like labels. Led by liberal progressives. If you read this book and another book called Imbecile by Cohen, you'll find out that while they were lynching black people, they were trying to sterilize poor white people. SubhanAllah. You better understand what's going on. And it might have been your ancestors, by the way, that they were trying to sterilize. There was a court case called Buck versus Bell that went to the Supreme Court in 1924. And this poor black woman, they set her up to be the test case, right? And it was in this book called Imbecile. And as a result of that Supreme Court case on the Supreme Court, led by liberal Bostonian Oliver Wendell Holmes, 60,000 people in the United States of America were forcibly sterilized. And it started with poor white people, and of course it spread to black and brown people. Of course. Where was the largest number? In the state of California, that liberal state, right? And so you should read to understand that this is just not a black-white problem, even though you should fight and get justice for George Floyd, but you should understand this is a problem that we all have and we've had as Imam Khalid from the beginning of this, Imam Khalid, from the beginning of this nature. Okay, let me quit because I know we're running out of time. The second thing is engage. There's a book by a friend of mine who used to teach at Yale Law School and also an Episcopal priest. It's called Racial Healing. And it talks about the fact that Americans hate to talk to one about each other about race. I think we should talk simply because things have changed and that there are things we can do together to make life better. When my son was killed by a police officer 23 years ago, the first thing I did, I called the police department because I'm a taxpayer and I wanted to know what the chief of police thought about it. I called the mayor because I'm a taxpayer and I want to know what the mayor thought about it. I called the head of the police commissioner and talked to him because I wanted, you know what I said to them? I said, do you have any children? They said, yeah. Do you have anybody who's 21, 22 years old? They said, yeah. I said, if you cover this up, if you don't bring justice to Malik Jones, I guarantee you that somebody white is going to be killed in similar circumstances. This happened with the East Haven Police Department. Within 3 years, a white woman in similar circumstances, it was a traffic stop. She's driving away from the officer. They killed her. And so we're interconnected. And if we engage, we'll find out. Finally, we need to dismantle these systems that Imam Khalid is talking about. That's why the Poor People's Campaign is so important. That's why joining together and focusing on the economic injustice in this corner is important. But I want to say one additional thing is that I beg to differ with Imam Khalid when he says that Black people don't have much power. I would recommend a book called Disintegration by Eugene Robinson. In it, he says the first chapter of that book is Black Americans don't live here anymore. There used to be a time 50, 60 years ago when the majority of Black people, 60% of the people, lived at or near the poverty level. That is not true today. Most Black Americans are like yourself and myself. Well, I can't speak for you, man. I haven't seen your tax returns. So I'll speak for myself that I'm not at or near the poverty level. I retired as a full tenure professor, and that's not a poverty job. And I'm not the only one. We have Obama, we have Oprah. We have a large number of people, and Imam Khalid will know what I'm talking about. 50, 60 years ago, we had so few, they'd all fit in the cover of Jet magazine, right? They'd all be the 3 or 4 people we had in Jet magazine. We had people who run American Express. We got somebody running McDonald's right now. I'm not loving it though. But my point is that the largest group in the African American community right now is the middle class, not the poor people, not the 25% of poor. That doesn't mean, let me just emphasize that racism is there. We have the body of Floyd, we have the body of our sister Jamila, who we should pray for, that Allah gives her Jannah as a shaheed. We have evidence. That doesn't mean that racism has gone away, but how we approach it, particularly in the African American community, and how Muslims approach us should be different. For instance, people don't pitch to the African American community. Muslim organizations don't pitch to the African American community because they think we're primarily poor. There's lots of money in the African American community in the so-called middle class. And so my point is that we need to work together to dismantle those racist institutions we talked about, the criminal justice system, the healthcare system. We need to work together, and actions like the Poor People's Campaign are aimed in that direction.
Excuse me. If I could just respond just very briefly, Dr. Jones.
Sure.
And that is, I like to use a quote that Malcolm famously talked about when he talked about the disparity, the wealth disparities and other kinds of disparities between the so-called white community and the so-called Black community, to find what you were saying. And he was saying that the gap, it's a fact right now that the wealth gap between white America and Black America is much larger today than it was in the 1960s. And it's only gotten wider. And so what Malcolm's saying before his assassination was that back, it's like, he said, it's like flying in a plane. You can be on a plane that's flying 300 miles an hour, or in a plane flying 1,000 miles an hour, but people are still in the back of the plane. And so Black people are moving faster because everybody's moving faster, but we're still in the back. So by my saying that Black people don't have the power, it's not a statement of a denial that there are some Black folks like yourself who are middle class. There are some Black folks like Oprah and Michael Jordan and all these other people are upper class by any measure, any standard of measurement. But in terms of their ability to effectuate change, it is for the most part to be, in my humble opinion, dependent upon those people who are the power holders in the society. We agitate for change. And I think we have this responsibility to do that. Someone like Obama, as president of the United States for 8 years, in spite of his being in that position, in my opinion, he was like the captain of a ship. The ship had its charted direction, and it was his responsibility, either in a Trumpian kind of way or in an Obamian kind of way. His responsibility was to guide that ship and make sure that that ship got to a certain place. And so I'm saying that Black folks, for the most part, in the United States, have not been in those genuine power positions to determine the direction of what's going on. It's like when Big George Bush, H.W. Bush, started talking about a new world order, right? He was in a position of influence and access where he knew exactly what he was talking about, because there were people who were determined what order, what direction they wanted this nation to go and for the world to go. But for the most part, these were not Black folks who have been in a position in America to determine directions. We, inshallah, and Muslims in this country, I feel the same phenomena that we, as Muslims in particular, Black, whatever ethnicity or geographic area that we come from, it's my humble opinion that rather than perpetuating, trying to get a piece of the pie, I believe, as Dr. Martin Luther King said, close to the end of his life, is that one thing that he had determined was that, and what he was being remorseful about, was that he was actually leading Black people into a burning house, because what was being made available to him was not, in the long run, something that would guarantee the success of Black folks in this country, either spiritually or in every other kind of way. So I think that we have to be careful, and I'm not addressing this saying that you're advocating this, but I think as Muslims in general, we have to be careful that in our Americanism, in our citizenship as Americans, that we don't lose sight of that prophetic model, that we don't lose sight of what the kind of society that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala wants us to advocate for, whether it's centuries down the road, whether it will ever happen or not. I just think that, so I'm not going to go on and on.
Our time is up, but I just want to say three quick things. I just beg to differ on the economic data. Look at the census data, and I don't know what you feel about that. And secondly,
you think that Black people are at the same level economically?
I waited. Right. Look at the census data, and I'd like to show it to you. That's number one. And number two, Oprah helped, for good or for ill. Oprah, if it hadn't been for Oprah Winfrey, Obama would not become president of the United States, for good or for ill. And I didn't agree with Obama's policies. That's the second point. And the third point is that I'm not waving the American flag, because my flag is the Quran, right? But my obligation, we agree on the last point, is to make this thing better while I'm here, and to help other people, whether they're Muslim, non-Muslim, black, or white, which we're doing, by the way, for People's Campaign. But we shouldn't fool ourselves that America now is the same as it was 50, 60 years ago. It simply is not.
Okay. So actually, we are actually out of time. There were some questions about book recommendations. So, Dr. Jimmy Jones, if you can email me the list of the books, I can put them in the description. So those who want to look at the books, you can do so from the description section of the YouTube video. And I'll put them up. So once he emails me the books, I will list them up, and you can find them on Amazon. And I think there was a question about something about how to direct the youth. We have other lectures about that. We've had youth come on on one of our sessions, and they've talked about how to get youth involved. So you can refer to those. Again, go to our you can go to our website, ICNA.org/racism. All of the video interviews that we've done so far, they're all on there. So there's one on from a youth perspective as well. We invited some youth to talk about the topic, so you can look at that, inshallah. Anyway, jazakallah khair to both of our speakers for joining us. Inshallah, maybe we can have another discussion on this topic, and you guys can dish it out over there, inshallah. But inshallah, we'll have so thank you everyone for joining us.
We're on the same team, Imam Khalid and I.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. Okay, so inshallah, jazakallah khair for everyone joining us. Thank you so much, and we'll see you next time, inshallah. Hopefully next week we plan to do another webinar. So please join us every week for a different program on different topics related to social justice issues. And obviously, given the situation right now, we're focusing mainly on anti-racism. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.
Wa alaikum assalam.